Sometimes there's a need to run some logic when a component was mounted to the DOM. For example, we might want to make an API call to get some data from the API server when the component was first mounted. A typical scenario would be in the rendering of the navbar. In a lot of apps, we will typically have a sign in button in the navigation bar. Now, depending on whether the user is logged in or not, we might want to display the user's avatar if the user is logged in, or the login button if the user is not logged in. In other words, when a navbar is mounted in a DOM, we probably need to send an API request to the backend to see if the user is logged in or not. Now, to run a certain logic when a component is mounted, I'm going to introduce you a new hook function called useEffect. Let's look at how this thing works. We'll go to our navbar component, and the first thing that we want to do is to import the function. VS Code is smart enough to import it for us if we hit tab on the autocomplete. Now, the useEffect function accepts two arguments. The first argument is a callback function where we'll define the logic to run in this useEffect. The second argument is an array of state that we want this useEffect to watch in order to trigger the logic that we define in this useEffect. In general, there are three forms of useEffect: a useEffect that does not have a second argument, a useEffect that has an empty array as a second argument, and thirdly, a useEffect with some sort of state inside the second argument. Let's go through them one by one, and I'll show you the differences between them. We'll start by the useEffect in the second form, where it has an empty array in the second argument. And again, the second argument defines what state would the useEffect should listen to in order to trigger the logic. By default, all the useEffect will be triggered when a component was mounted. By passing, an empty array says that the useEffect is not listening to anything. Therefore, this useEffect will only be run once, when a component was mounted. I'll print out some dummy console log inside this useEffect just for demonstration. Let's go to our browser, and if we look inside the console, we see our text gets printed out in the browser console. It was printed out for 2 times merely because we are using React strict mode. Next, let's look at the third form of the useEffect. In this case, the logic will be triggered whenever there's a change in our state that we put inside the second argument. Just for demonstration, we'll create 2 states. And we'll get the useEffect to listen to one of the states. And now if you look at the browser console, the functions in both useEffects are triggering. That's because, as I mentioned before, all the useEffect logic will be triggered whenever the component was mounted. And now I'll attempt to modify our state counter A and see if that useEffect will be triggered. Let's create a new button, and when we click on this button, we will increment the value of counter A. And now whenever we click on the button, we can see that the useEffect logic is triggering, because the useEffect is listening to changes in counter A. If we make changes to counter B, this useEffect will not give a damn. Unless we add counter B to the watch array. Once we have added counter B, clicking on the button will start triggering the logic once again. However, subsequent click will not retrigger the logic. This is because we are setting the value of counter B to always be the same value. Counter A, which is 0 at the moment, plus 1, which will always equal to 1. Now the useEffect will only be triggered when there's a change in the state. Since counter B is not changing, therefore it will not retrigger the logic. If we change the value to be counter B plus 1, clicking on the button now will then start triggering the logic, because every time we click on the button, the value of counter B will be changed. Now let's talk about the first form. If we don't pass in a second argument to the useEffect, then the useEffect will listen to all the state changes in the current component. So now when I click on the button, I am changing counter B, yet it will trigger the listen to all useEffect. So once again, in a nutshell, if we do not pass in a second argument to useEffect, then this useEffect will listen to all the state changes happening inside this component. If we decide to pass in an empty array as a second argument, then this useEffect will only be triggered for once when a component was mounted. If we do pass in some states in a second argument, then the useEffect will only be triggered when those states are changed. It might take some time to digest this, and in the future we'll look at some practical example where useEffect can be very useful in our application. For now, try to remember the different forms of useEffect, and we will continue in the next lesson. Alright, key takeaways for this lesson. useEffect is a rag hook that will trigger a function whenever there is a state change. All the useEffect hooks will be triggered once when a component was first mounted. The first argument is a callback function where we define the logic for the useEffect. And the second argument is an array of state where we want the useEffect to listen to. That's it for now, and I'll see you again in the next lesson. If you enjoyed the content of this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the bell icon for more content to come. It will really help me out. Thanks for your support.